Her son filed for guardianship. Her daughter-in-law faked the breakdown on camera. And Margaret? She sat silent in court until the footage played. Gasps, lies unraveled. The judge called for an investigation. She was never confused, just recording everything. They tried to erase her, but she brought the receipts. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Got a bruise that wasn't mine. They said I forgot how I got hurt, but I remember who took the picture. Margaret didn't hear the knock. She felt it. A sharp, sudden pounding at the door, a rhythm too official to be neighborly, reverberated through her ribcage like a warning. Her tea trembled slightly on the tray. The silence that followed was worse. She opened the door to find 2 uniformed officers and a woman in a navy pantsuit holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Margaret Hale?" the social worker asked, with a soft voice that smelled like polite danger. "Yes," Margaret replied evenly, though her hand gripped the frame just a second longer than necessary. "How can I help you?" "We received an anonymous report regarding a potential issue of elder neglect and possible cognitive decline," the officer explained, glancing sideways at the social worker. "Do you mind if we ask you a few questions?" Margaret didn't flinch. "Of course not," she said, stepping aside. Her voice, steady as always, but her mind was racing. Inside, they examined the house, noticing framed photos, the meticulous bookshelf, the spotless hardwood floors. A faint scent of lavender and old paper lingered in the air. Nothing screamed chaos, nothing screamed neglect, except her arm. "You have a bruise," the social worker noted, gesturing to a faint purple ring on Margaret's left forearm. Margaret looked down. The bruise was minor, a result of bumping into the antique hallway table 3 days ago while carrying laundry. But that explanation wasn't requested. "It's healing," she said quietly. "Nothing serious." The officer gently prodded. "Can you tell us how you got it?" Margaret blinked once. Her face remained composed. "I tripped. On the hallway rug." The social worker scribbled something down. Then came the line she had feared. "There are concerns that you may not be fully aware of your surroundings or of your own injuries." And there it was. The script she hadn't written but had seen coming. Adam, or worse, Melanie. The bruise had barely formed when Melanie hovered near her that morning, iPhone angled discreetly. Margaret had caught her reflection in the hallway mirror, snapping a photo under the pretense of fixing her hair. "I'm sure your family just wants to make sure you're safe," the officer added, his tone laced with something resembling sympathy. Margaret looked at them. Neither cruel, but neither truly listening either. They left 20 minutes later. The clipboard woman mentioned adult protective services. Nothing confirmed, just a possible assessment down the road. Margaret watched them drive off through the front blinds. A breeze brushed past her aging shoulders, but it wasn't cold. It was clarifying. She walked to the hallway, where the antique table stood silently, its curved leg still a little unsteady. Her hand grazed it gently. Then she turned toward her study. Inside, the room was bathed in amber light from the afternoon sun. The air smelled of leather-bound books, old ink, and something faintly medicinal. Against the far wall stood an old roll-top desk. She unlocked the bottom drawer. Beneath some faded envelopes and a dusty box of paper clips was a small black case. She opened it with care, like one might a relic. Inside was a pen, sleek, unassuming, but not ordinary. Her late husband's gift, a pen camera, hidden lens, long battery life, motion activated. She had used it once, years ago, to catch a dishonest housekeeper. Now it would serve a new purpose. She clicked it once, felt the faint vibration confirm it was still operational. "You're up again," she whispered to it. As she stood up, a faint chuckle escaped her lips, dry, without joy. A memory flickered, her mother's voice, raspy and clear from a hospital bed years ago. "Don't waste your breath on people who underestimate you. Use your mind, use silence, use paper trails." Back in the hallway, she stared at the spot where Melanie had posed her concern with that camera-ready frown. She saw it now, not a moment of care, but a setup. Margaret set the pen camera carefully in the first book on the middle shelf. between the pages of a hollowed-out dictionary. The lens peeked out behind a layer of dust and Latin roots. She didn't shake. She didn't cry. She simply whispered, "If they want to build a case, I'll build a better one." The guest with no voice. They said I needed rest, but they just wanted me quiet. The first thing to disappear was the sound of her own name. Mom became her. She wants this. She's not used to routine. She doesn't know what's good for her. Margaret sat at the kitchen table one morning, the sunlight cutting across her lap in pale streaks, and listened to her son and his wife argue just out of earshot, or so they thought. She asked if she could go to the store, Melanie said with an exaggerated groan. She can't even carry groceries anymore. I'll just tell her the car's low on gas. Adam mumbled something, low, indecisive, as always. She doesn't need to be out, Melanie continued. It's safer if we keep her here, honestly, especially after the incident. Margaret stared down at her plate. Eggs, overcooked. Toast, barely warm. Not that she had made it. She hadn't cooked in days, or chosen a meal, or even handled the salt herself. A pink sticky note was placed on the fridge. Breakfast, 8 a.m. sharp, do not reheat. Next to it, a color-coded schedule. TV time, 1 to 2 p.m. Walk around the yard, with supervision. Medication check, 5:30 p.m. Lights out, 9 p.m. No doctor had mandated this. No therapist had recommended a timetable. This was Melanie's doing, and Adam's silence made it law. Margaret's mail no longer reached her hands directly. Packages vanished before she saw them. Even the family phone line had been rerouted. Every call was now screened. Every errand was handled. Every question she asked was met with the same syrupy poison. "Don't worry about it, Mom. You should be resting." She wasn't resting. She was writing. Inside the bottom drawer of her bedside table, tucked between expired coupons and knitting needles, sat a leather-bound journal. Inside it, her notes, written in shorthand she had created decades ago while temping as a transcriptionist. To anyone else, it would look like gibberish. To Margaret, it was a blueprint. 9:03 a.m. She unplugged the modem for 2 minutes, said no distractions. 11:17 a.m. Adam said he's almost convinced about guardianship. 2:42 p.m. Phone call. Lawyer said it'll be easier if she starts slipping. She already is. That night, when the house was quiet and the hallway creaked like it always did near the third floorboard, Margaret slipped into the living room. Her movements were slow but precise. She pulled a thick hardcover off the middle shelf, Atlas of the World, 1997 edition. Inside, nestled between carved-out pages, was the pen camera. The lens blinked green once. Live. She nestled it just right, facing the couch. The next day, she sat quietly in her chair near the window as Melanie entered the room with a glass of juice and a too-wide smile. "There you go, Margaret," Melanie cooed, setting the glass down on the side table. "Vitamin C. You've got to keep that sharp brain of yours working." She even patted Margaret's hand, as if Margaret didn't remember the times Melanie had flinched at the idea of hugging her. Then, Melanie turned toward the bookshelf, pretending to rearrange a few titles, her voice soft and venomous. "Soon," she whispered to the spines of the books, "this will all be ours." The pen cam caught everything. That night in her room, Margaret replayed the footage, watching Melanie's faux compassion melt into greed. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then typed slowly, purposefully. 2. Carol.sutterfield@mail.com. Subject, discreet legal. Help, Carol. It's happening. I need a lawyer. Quietly. Call me tomorrow. Code word, chrysanthemums. Don't reply to this email. Margaret hit send, then closed the laptop with a click sharp enough to cut through her doubt. They had tried to shrink her world to one room, one chair, one meal at a time, but they'd forgotten. She had lived an entire life before them, and she was still living it now. The memory they tried to erase. They said I was losing memory, but I remember every betrayal. The wind was brisk for early spring, brushing through the branches with a hiss like gossip on the verge of spilling. Margaret sat on a bench at the far end of Prescott Park, wrapped in a slate blue cardigan and her usual composed silence. Carol arrived right on time, hair pulled back, notebook in hand, sharp as ever despite the retirement title. She scanned the empty park, then sat beside Margaret with the kind of stillness that made her feel 20 years younger and twice as seen. "I brought the tea," Carol said quietly, sliding a thermos across the bench, "and I brought the law." Margaret managed a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Tell me what they can take, and what I can still protect." Carol flipped open the notebook. Her pen hovered above the margin. "If they get a court to declare you mentally incompetent, you could lose full control. Bank accounts, property, even medical decisions, especially if Adam gets power of attorney." Margaret's jaw tightened. "He asked me to sign something last month. I told him I wanted to think about it." Carol blinked. "Did you?" "I tucked it away. Didn't feel right." "Good. Don't sign anything. Not without me. And from now on, document everything. Dates, witnesses, emails, transactions." Margaret nodded slowly. "I've already started. I'm moving the antiques out of the dining room, too. Melanie's been eyeing them." They paused as a jogger passed, footsteps rhythmic, unaware that two women in their late 60s were plotting a legal resistance that would leave no room for mercy. "I want you to store some papers," Margaret said. "Bank files, deed copies, birth certificates, anything that matters." Carol took a slow sip of tea. "You really think this is going to get that ugly?" Margaret didn't blink. "I don't think. I know." That afternoon when she returned home, Margaret moved like a ghost. Soft, soundless, seen by no one. Adam was on a conference call in the kitchen. Melanie was upstairs, laughing into her AirPods. No one noticed her as she slipped into her room and locked the door behind her. From under the floorboard, one Adam had helped her replace years ago, she pulled out a folder wrapped in cloth. In it, account numbers, passwords, will drafts, even the letter her late husband had written before he died. She skimmed the papers once more, then replaced the letter and took the rest. That night, she met Carol again, but this time, not in the open. A coffee shop 30 minutes out of town. Margaret arrived in sunglasses and a hat, just like in the movies. Carol, ever the stealth operative, wore a trench coat and carried a plain Trader Joe's bag that nobody would question. Inside it, a flash drive and 5 folders. The next morning, from her room, Margaret initiated the transfer. $46,000 from the joint family account into a separate, trust-protected fund she had opened under her maiden name. No alerts, no flags. The money was hers to begin with. But now, it was only hers. She leaned back in the chair, heart pounding. She hadn't felt this alert in months, not since before the bruise, before the cameras, before the masks fell off her own blood. That evening, while sorting through her filing cabinet to replace what she'd moved, she came across a crisp white envelope tucked between tax forms, her name printed on the front in Adam's handwriting. She opened it, expecting a bill or maybe a note he hadn't had the guts to say aloud. Instead, she found a scanned copy of a medical power of attorney document, dated, stamped, signed, and at the bottom, her own signature, perfect cursive, flawless stroke, not hers. Her chest went tight, her fingertips ran across the ink like it would rewrite itself if she willed it. The penmanship was close, very close, but not close enough. "I never signed this," she whispered aloud. And suddenly, the air in the room shifted. Everything up to now had been quiet defense, controlled, strategic. But this was war. She stood still, the forged paper trembling in her hand, and murmured, "Now it's not just betrayal, it's a crime." They didn't want answers, they wanted a label. The knock came at 9:07 a.m., too early for a neighbor, too polite for a delivery. Margaret opened the front door slowly, eyeing the woman on the porch. Mid-30s, clipboard in hand, a faux warm smile stretched across her face like a customer service ad. "Good morning, Ms. Margaret Holloway." Her voice was bright. Too bright. Margaret nodded, lips thinning. "Yes. And you are?" "Dr. Shauna Reese, licensed psych evaluator. Your daughter-in-law Melanie scheduled an in-home wellness screening. Just routine. Mind if I come in?" Margaret stepped aside, the smile never touching her face. "Of course. Let's both pretend it's routine." Inside, the morning light spilled through the curtains. catching the dust mid-air like snowfall. Margaret led her to the small sunroom, the one room Melanie hadn't tried to redecorate yet. Dr. Rice sat, unzipping her folder. "Now, no pressure here, Margaret. This is just a friendly check-in. You're not being tested." Margaret gave her a long look. "Of course not. Just observed, judged, and possibly committed." The therapist chuckled politely, pen poised. "Let's begin." The questions were predictable. "Do you remember today's date?" "Yes, and tomorrow's court filing deadline if you're interested." "Have you been experiencing confusion, loss of appetite, mood swings?" "Not since I stopped eating Melanie's cooking." Dr. Rice scribbled something and didn't look up. Margaret noticed the red ink. Curious? Defensive? She leaned in slightly. "Tell me, doctor, how do you distinguish between paranoia and well-founded caution when the people questioning your sanity are the ones managing your medication?" The woman finally looked up. A pause. The first real one. Margaret saw it land, saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. But it wasn't enough. So Margaret added, "You might want to ask who opened this appointment. It wasn't me." That earned another note. Halfway through, Margaret let her voice soften, strategically. She fumbled a word, asked to repeat a question, looked out the window, and pretended to forget the last digit of her ZIP code. Just enough, not too much. Then, casually, she dropped a legal term. Undue influence. Another one. Fraudulent transfer. Dr. Rice blinked. Margaret smiled. "Oh, don't mind me," she added. "Just light reading. I've had time." In the far corner, nestled in the old bookshelf, the pen camera's red light blinked once. Still rolling. The session wrapped in less than 45 minutes. Dr. Rice stood, her polite mask loosening just a little. "I'll file my notes. You'll receive a copy in a few weeks." Margaret nodded and followed her to the door. Melanie was already waiting at the bottom of the stairs. "Well?" she asked, too eagerly. "Is she, declining?" The therapist blinked. "It's too early for conclusions." Melanie's face fell, just a flicker, but Margaret caught it. And so did the camera. That night, through the thin drywall of her bedroom, Margaret heard Melanie's voice, low and sharp as a knife. "She's smarter than she looks," Melanie hissed. "Too damn sharp, and if that report doesn't say dementia, we're screwed." Adam grunted something unintelligible, then a pause. "Then maybe we push harder," Melanie said. Margaret didn't sleep that night. Instead, she stayed up editing, the full video session, the whisper at the end. Her calm, logical answers layered beside Melanie's desperation. By morning, it was neatly exported to a USB, password locked. No name, no note. Just one line typed in the email to an anonymous legal contact she'd once helped through a wrongful eviction. Subject, "For your files, please hold until further notice." She clicked send. As she slipped the USB backup into her coat pocket, she muttered under her breath, "You wanted to diagnose me, but I've already written your prognosis. They tried to trap me with lies, I captured them with lenses." The ticking of the wall clock had never sounded louder. Margaret sat in her dimly lit study, hunched over her laptop, the soft glow painting her tired face in muted golds and blues. She clicked play on the first video file, time-stamped Tuesday, 2:04 p.m. Melanie's voice echoed from the screen. "I mean, it's sad, but what are we supposed to do when she forgets to turn the stove off again?" Margaret leaned closer. "She didn't forget," Melanie muttered in the clip, pacing the living room, rehearsing. "You have to look concerned, but not accusatory. Got it? Again. We're just worried about her. Say it." Then Adam's voice, robotic, practiced. "We're just worried about her." "Less wooden," Melanie snapped. Margaret clicked pause. Her hand didn't shake, her breathing didn't falter. She was done grieving. One by one, she stitched together 6 days' worth of footage, quiet conversations, whispered rehearsals, smug laughs when they thought she was asleep. She highlighted each clip with crisp labels. Manipulation, false statement, mockery. Every frame was time-stamped. She wasn't just documenting abuse, she was building a timeline of betrayal. In another video, Melanie leaned into the phone, her voice syrupy. I'm telling you, she's slipping fast. Adam and I are just trying to do what's best. She needs full supervision, maybe even memory care. Margaret rewound it, listened again, then clicked save. On her desk sat 2 USB drives, identical in appearance but very different in purpose. One was encrypted, protected, and stored in a velvet pouch. That one, she placed in a small manila envelope and sealed shut with tape. On the outside, she scrawled, "Insurance. M." The second was a decoy, a dummy file with one innocuous clip, her watering plants in silence. She left the decoy in the top drawer of her nightstand, just visible enough to be found by someone searching. By noon, she drove to a modest cafe on the other side of town, neutral territory. The air smelled of ground espresso and something cinnamon sweet. At a table in the far corner sat Linda, her former co-worker from the insurance office, now a cybersecurity consultant. Reliable, quiet, loyal. Still encrypting secrets? Margaret smiled faintly as she sat down. "Only the juicy ones," Linda replied, returning the smile. "What's in the envelope?" "My protection," Margaret said simply. "Keep it safe, don't open it, not yet." Linda tucked the envelope into her bag without a word. By evening, Margaret was back home when the doorbell rang. Adam. He didn't wait for her to answer, just let himself in with his copy of the key and stormed into the kitchen, a folded document in hand. "You've been acting erratically," he said, tossing the papers onto the table. "We're applying for emergency guardianship. It's for your own good." Margaret didn't flinch. Her eyes fell to the heading. Notice of petition. Guardianship due to mental incapacity. The words bled like ink across her vision, but her spine stayed straight. She touched the worn edge of her sweater and said nothing for a long moment. Adam looked uncomfortable in the silence. "Look, Mom, Melanie and we just think it's time to take some responsibility off your shoulders. You're not, well, did you file this?" she finally asked, her voice calm. He hesitated, then nodded. "It's already with the court." Margaret nodded too. And then smiled. Not the kind of smile that sought peace, the kind that knew something he didn't. That night, she slipped into her room, locked the door, and wrote a single note in her coded diary. He just made his biggest mistake. She placed the court notice beside her laptop. She didn't need to record her thoughts aloud. The cameras had already done the speaking for her. Margaret clicked send on a scheduled email. Subject line, "Playback is power. Delivery. 1 day before the hearing. I paid for the bricks, now they want to bury me under them." The photo still hung by the hallway, sun-bleached, cracked at the edges. Margaret stood before it now, watching a much younger version of herself and her late husband smile in front of a row of vintage Chevys, the kind of photo people passed by every day without knowing its weight. 6 cars, 6 immaculate, garage-kept classics. She had watched each of them roll away on flatbeds, one by one, sold to fund a dream Adam once swore he'd build with integrity. This house, his future, her sacrifice. Now, standing in the same house with silence pressing against her ribs like concrete, Margaret couldn't shake the bitter truth. The bricks she paid for were now being weaponized to wall her in. From upstairs came the sound of Melanie's voice. She wasn't trying to be quiet. No, quartz countertops definitely, and that ugly chandelier in the dining room is going the moment Margaret's out of the picture. She laughed. "We're overdue for a full remodel, a real one, not this hand-me-down sad grandma aesthetic." Margaret stood still. Her hand brushed the frame of the photograph, then quietly turned and walked to her room. She opened the file drawer beneath her bed. Inside were stacks of paper labeled in Carol's handwriting: estate revisions, asset protections, durable will reclamation. They'd been working for weeks. Each document was crisp, notarized, and sealed with the kind of legality that didn't shout. It whispered ruin in a courtroom. Carol had warned her, "Don't confront them. Document everything. Let the law carry the blade." So Margaret did. Every piece of fine art, photographs, sculptures, the antique mirror in the foyer, was catalogued and discreetly moved into a rented storage unit downtown. Every antique plate, every vase her mother had once gifted her, wrapped in linen and driven out in the back of a rideshare SUV. Melanie hadn't noticed yet, but she would. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Margaret welcomed a mobile notary into the home. The woman was polite, young, professional. Margaret signed her name slowly, deliberately, on the updated will, the document sliding across the table like a knife beneath silk. When the notary asked, "Do you wish to revoke all previous declarations of inheritance in favor of this one?" Margaret didn't blink. "I do." It was the most unromantic vow she'd ever uttered, and perhaps the most satisfying. That evening, the house was filled with the scent of roasted garlic and lemon, Margaret's signature chicken. She cooked like always, without being asked, without thanks. It was the only part of her routine they hadn't tried to control, perhaps because they liked to eat. As dinner cooled on the counter, she passed the study and paused. Melanie was on speakerphone, her voice honeyed and vicious. "She doesn't even realize we're finalizing the refinance. By next month, this place is in our name. Legally. The old bat still thinks she owns things." Margaret froze, not from fear but from the velocity of rage crashing into her chest. It didn't show on her face. Her jaw didn't twitch, her hands didn't shake, but inside something shifted like a tectonic plate dislodging. She backed away, slowly, quietly. Later, in the safety of her bedroom, she opened her journal and wrote just one line beneath that day's entry. "They're not burying me in this house. They're burying themselves." Through the paper-thin walls, Margaret hears Melanie's final, careless whisper of the night. "She'll be gone by next month, legally. They tried to make me a villain, but they made me visible." The photo Melanie chose was carefully staged. Margaret sat on the garden bench, sun in her eyes, a knit blanket thrown over her shoulders like a pity prop. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers lightly curled. Melanie had even angled the frame to include the wilted flowers in the background for extra drama. The caption read, "Watching dementia take someone you love is like losing them twice. I'll never stop fighting for her dignity, even when she forgets me." Hashtag, your caregiving heart. Our story matters. By mid-morning, the post had over 6,000 likes. Margaret sat across the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a hot mug of Earl Grey, her phone screen glowing. She zoomed in on her own face. The look wasn't vacant, it was focused. Focused on the camera she had spotted 3 seconds before the photo was taken. The look said, "I see you, and I'm waiting." She hit the screenshot button. And then again. And again. Each new post, Melanie brushing her hair, spoon-feeding her soup she didn't need, filming shaky videos of Margaret losing track of the day on cue, became another piece of a new puzzle Margaret was building. Online sympathy poured in, messages like, "You're so strong, Melanie. What a blessing you are for caring for her. She looks so confused. It's heartbreaking." Margaret scrolled in silence, the scent of jasmine from her teacup mixed with the bitter aftertaste of violation. She didn't feel heartbroken. She felt fury wrapped in velvet. That evening, while Adam was out and Melanie preoccupied with her phone, Margaret set up her counterstrike. She placed her tripod in the kitchen, angled the frame to catch the full countertop, and herself standing upright. The pen cam stayed tucked in the bookshelf. This one was for the public. A controlled, deliberate performance. Click, record. She cracked eggs, poured flour, whisked a batter with strong, purposeful hands. "Good evening," she said into the lens, voice calm. "Today we're making lemon lavender scones. While I cook, I'll walk you through Article 4, Section 3 of the Elder Legal Rights Act, because memory loss doesn't equal incompetence, and feigning silence doesn't mean absence." She recited lines from memory. Then she smiled and solved a Sudoku puzzle in real time, one Melanie had left half-done days before, publicly saying it was too advanced for Margaret now. Margaret ended the video with a line that landed like a scalpel. "You can edit a photo, but you can't fake the truth when it's time-stamped." She posted it to a private YouTube channel under the name Margaret Not Missing. The first comment came within the hour, then 5 more, then 20. "Wait, she doesn't look like someone with dementia. Why is this giving me Munchausen vibes? This woman is sharp. What is going on here? Someone found Melanie's viral post and linked it below the video. The contrast stung like an exposed wire. Margaret didn't comment. She didn't have to. The court of public opinion had begun to stir. 2 days later, she opened her inbox to a message from a local journalist. "Hi, Margaret. I've come across your video and the social posts your daughter-in-law made. Something doesn't add up. Would you be willing to share your side? On record?" Margaret's fingers hovered above the keyboard. She read the message twice, her heart steady. Then she typed, "Thank you for reaching out. I'd be willing to speak, on one condition. I speak after the court date, not before." She hit send. And as the cursor blinked, a smile returned to her face. Not the kind they could twist into tragedy, but the kind that knew it was already winning. The next morning, Melanie walks into the kitchen and gasps. Her phone is buzzing with dozens of messages. Margaret calmly pours her tea and asks, "You didn't think I was just knitting, did you?" Her tears weren't real, but my bruises were. The first sound was a door creaking open, too slowly, too deliberately. Margaret didn't lift her head from the book in her lap. She had already pressed record on the pen cam hidden behind the family photo on the mantel. It blinked once. Ready. Melanie's voice floated in from the hallway like syrup hiding a razor. "Mom, are you okay?" Margaret looked up, her face blank. Calm. She knew what was coming, so she gave her nothing. But Melanie kept walking in anyway, clutching her phone in front of her like a stage light, recording every step. "Oh no, are you crying again?" she said dramatically, voice pitching up in feigned panic. Margaret didn't blink. "I was reading." No, she's been like this all day," Melanie muttered into the phone camera now, turning it slightly so Margaret's silver hair, cardigan, and the neutral lamp behind her could all fit perfectly in frame. "She thinks I'm her sister sometimes. Keeps asking for someone named Evelyn." Margaret let a beat of silence stretch between them, then softly replied, "Evelyn was the dog." Melanie flinched, but covered it with a soft gasp, biting her lip. "Oh, that's even worse." When Margaret didn't respond, Melanie leaned in, tapping the screen as if to end the recording. But Margaret caught the glimpse of the red dot still pulsing, still filming. The act was live. That night, after Melanie went to bed, Margaret sat at her desk under a soft pool of lamplight, scrolling through the footage from earlier in the week. She paused on the clip from 2 nights ago, Melanie in the bathroom, practicing her lines in the mirror. Margaret zoomed in. There, word for word, the exact phrases from earlier. "She keeps asking for Evelyn." Same cadence, same lip tremble. She split the screen, rehearsal on the left, today's performance on the right. Synced them up. The similarity was eerie, scripted, artificial, cold. By morning, Carol had arrived. She wore her paralegal years like armor. Efficient black slacks, rolled sleeves, reading glasses balanced at the edge of her nose. "You're sure you want to submit this?" she asked, scanning the affidavit template they were editing together. Margaret nodded. "We've held back long enough." Carol inserted the screenshots side by side. The caption under each read, "Rehearsal, March 5th. Submission, March 7th. Time-stamped, digitally verified." "Judges hate manufactured emotion," Carol murmured, almost to herself. "This is going to hurt them." Margaret tilted her head, half smiling. "Good. They've made a career of trying to hurt me." Later that afternoon, Margaret's phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She let it ring once, twice, then picked up, saying nothing. A man's voice came through, overly calm. Too smooth. "Mrs. Langley? This is Darren Pierce. I represent your son Adam in the pending guardianship petition. I'm reaching out to, hopefully, resolve things before they become unnecessarily public." Margaret sipped her tea, waited, let the silence speak. Pierce cleared his throat. "My client is prepared to drop the competency challenge if you agree not to countersue for fraud. No statements to press. No video leaks, a clean, quiet close." Margaret glanced out the window, where Melanie was arguing with someone on her cell near the mailbox. Her voice was raised. No more sweet syrup, only vinegar and static. Margaret brought the phone back to her ear. "Tell your client I said no." A pause. "I'm sorry?" the lawyer asked. Margaret's voice was low, decisive, without tremor. "I'll see you in court." She hung up, then turned to Carol, who had just walked back into the room with a USB in hand. "Ready?" Carol asked. Margaret nodded once. "Let's give them something real to cry about." Across town, Melanie checks her inbox and sees an email titled "Perjury Risk Urgent Review" sent by her own legal team. They filed for power, but they woke mine. The envelope arrived in a manila shell, thick with threat. Bold black ink read, "Superior Court of Probate, Notice of Competency Hearing." Margaret opened it with deliberate calm, her fingers steady even as her heart gave one sharp thud. Guardianship petition filed by Adam Langley and Melanie Langley, reason for filing: cognitive decline, financial mismanagement, emotional instability. She read it twice, then once more, for the bitterness to pass. South, this was it, the moment they stopped pretending. That evening, Melanie hovered near her at all times, watching, hovering, pretending to fold laundry while her eyes flicked between the corner of the room and Margaret's face. Even the tea tasted like surveillance now. "You've been quiet," Melanie said over her shoulder. "Everything okay, Margaret?" Margaret sipped from her porcelain mug, letting the silence settle like dust. "Just pacing myself." "Right," Melanie said tightly. "Wouldn't want to wear yourself out before the big day." That night, Margaret sat on her bed, the soft hum of the air vent filling the silence. She opened her notebook, flipping past pages of recorded conversations, time-stamped events, and quiet betrayals. Her phone buzzed once, a voicemail. She hadn't heard it ring. The number was unknown, but the voice, when it began, sent something cold crawling along her spine. "Margaret, you don't know me, but I know what they're doing. You're not alone. I used to date Melanie. I know how she works, and if you need proof, I have it." A pause. Then, "Call me back, please." Margaret stared at the screen, frozen. The next day, Carol met her at the library cafe. The same cafe where they'd drafted the affidavit. It had become their war room. Margaret slid the phone across the table. "Voicemail came in last night." Carol listened. Her eyebrows lifted, slightly, then all the way. "Well?" Carol said slowly. "That's unexpected." His voice was steady, Margaret replied. "Not begging, not bluffing." Carol tapped the screen to replay the final line. "I know how she works." "I'll trace him," Carol said, "carefully. We don't bring him in unless we verify every word, but this could flip the case." "Flip it," Margaret said, "or burn it." They shared a look. For the first time in weeks, Margaret's smile wasn't bitter, it was sharp. A warning. The hearing was 6 days away. Each night, Melanie became more paranoid. She unplugged the living room lamp, claiming the bulb buzzed weird. She began checking Margaret's room, pretending to clean, but always hovering by the dresser, the bookshelf. Margaret pretended not to notice. She let herself appear tired, distracted, but every glance was a calculation. By Wednesday, another envelope arrived. Witness list, proposed support for petitioners' claims, Melanie Langley, Dr. Benson, psychiatrist, financial reviewer, hired by Adam Langley. No mention of Margaret's name. No right to reply listed. Carol's voice on the phone that evening was dry and iron hard. "They're trying to stack the perception. Not facts, perception." "Then I'll become undeniable," Margaret said. On Thursday, she received a second voicemail from the same anonymous number. This time it included a recording, Melanie's voice, laughing. "If she even tries to fight it, we'll just say she's manic. All she does is write in that creepy little notebook. Adam, we've got this." Margaret hit replay. Once. Twice. Carol's response came within minutes. "Legally admissible. You just won the middle of the war." Margaret printed the transcript, saved the file, backed up the file, labeled the USB stick, "Fireproof Truth." That night she walked past Melanie in the hallway. Their eyes met for half a second. "Sleep well?" Melanie asked. Margaret smiled. "Like a woman with nothing to hide." Carol calls just after midnight. "The guy, Melanie's ex? His name's Eric. He's filed a restraining order before, and he's willing to testify under oath. They brought their lies to court. I brought evidence. The courtroom was too cold for July. Not the kind of cold that came from air conditioning, but the kind that hung in the air when you realized you were about to watch someone lie under oath. Margaret sat straight-backed in her slate-gray blazer, the same one she'd worn to her husband's memorial service. Her hair was swept into a low knot, her expression calm, unshakable. But beneath the stillness, her pulse was a war drum. Docket 214-B, guardianship petition, Langley versus Langley. The clerk's voice cracked through the tension like a thin whip. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply folded her hands in her lap and looked ahead. Adam was already seated at the petitioner's table. Melanie next to him, dressed in a soft blush blouse and string of pearls. The performance had started before the gavel even fell. The judge, a lean silver-haired woman with sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes, addressed the room. "We'll hear from the petitioners first." Adam stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the stand like he was strolling through a job interview. "Your Honor," he began, voice calm, practiced. "This isn't easy, but my mother has been declining for some time, forgetting things, losing track of appointments, getting aggressive." Margaret didn't blink. He went on, painting her as disoriented, paranoid, financially unstable. He told the court he'd found her scribbling nonsense in a secret notebook, that she had accused Melanie of plotting against her with no proof. Melanie was called next. Tears, real or rehearsed, pooled in her eyes as she described nights of emotional turmoil, how she'd tried so hard to help Margaret. "But it was like living with a ghost that screamed at mirrors," she said. "I started fearing for her safety, for ours too." Gasps, murmurs. Then came cross-examination. Carol sat beside Margaret now as legal counsel. She rose slowly, approached Adam with a crispness that cut like glass. "You say she was confused. When did that confusion begin?" "Maybe 6 months ago," Adam replied. "And when did you first attempt to gain control of her finances?" He hesitated. "Around the same time." Carol raised an eyebrow. "How convenient." She paced slowly. "And the medical documentation you submitted, who scheduled that appointment?" "Melanie did." Carol turned to Melanie. "And were you present for the evaluation?" "Yes. To support her. Or to influence it." "Objection." "Sustained." The judge cut in. "Move on." But the room was shifting. The cracks had started forming. Then it was Margaret's turn. She took the stand slowly, not feebly, deliberately. She looked each juror in the eye, then the judge. "No rebuttal speech," Carol said. "Just play it." Margaret reached into her bag, pulled out a small USB. The courtroom's projector blinked to life. The footage was dated, time-stamped, and quiet. First, Melanie pacing the living room, muttering, then rehearsing phrases, crying, wiping her face, stopping, then redoing it from a different angle. Second, a quiet recording of Adam asking if Margaret's memory seemed slippy yet. Third, Melanie holding the phone near Margaret's door. "I'll say she screamed at me if I have to." The room went dead silent. Then came gasps. Even the bailiff turned. Adam buried his face in his hands. Melanie's face drained of all color. When the final clip ended, a voice memo of Margaret clearly explaining a bank transaction in flawless detail, the judge held up a hand. 10-minute recess, she said, voice tight. The courtroom exploded in murmurs as people filed out. Margaret stayed seated. Melanie leaned into Adam, voice trembling. She knew all along. Margaret heard it. She didn't need to respond. When court resumed, the judge's tone had changed. "We are moving forward with a fraud investigation," she said. "The evidence submitted will be reviewed by state counsel, and until further notice, this court halts all guardianship proceedings." The gavel struck, but it didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like the start of justice. As the courtroom emptied, the judge glanced toward her clerk and murmured something. Margaret couldn't hear it, but she saw the clerk scribble a note. "Notify DA's office. Possible criminal intent." In their silence, I heard everything. The house was quieter than it had ever been. No forced laughter from the kitchen, no fake concern trailing behind hollow questions, no slamming doors or whispered phone calls. Just silence. And Margaret had never heard so much truth in it. The courtroom fallout had detonated in slow motion. Adam and Melanie left the courthouse with jaws clenched and shoulders tight, barely exchanging a word. But the moment they stepped outside, it was no longer just a family matter. There were reporters parked near the sidewalk, questions flying, cameras clicking. Melanie had turned her face. Adam had said nothing. Back home, Margaret moved through the house with surgical calm. She didn't cry, she didn't smile, she simply moved. Drawer by drawer, file by file, she collected her life. Deeds, accounts, insurance, old letters, updated will, all packed into a locked briefcase she hadn't touched since George's funeral. The silence followed her everywhere. It wasn't empty, it was heavy with realization. She met Carol at their usual bench in the park the next morning. The wind was crisp, the trees just beginning to yellow for fall. "They've lawyered up," Carol said, handing over a manila folder. "But off record? Their legal team told them to go radio silent. Any more public defense and they'll dig themselves deeper." Margaret nodded. Let them stew in it. She signed a few more transfer documents, officially placing her remaining properties, bank accounts, and valuables under the secure trust they had restructured. The name on the file, Margaret Evelyn Hart, sole owner. That same evening, she received an email with a single subject line, "It's out." The blog post Carol had quietly helped draft, a concise, factual, documented narrative of everything, was now on a public awareness platform for elder financial abuse. Anonymous. But not unnoticed. By morning, it had 11,000 shares. By noon, Melanie's work had placed her on indefinite leave pending investigation. Not because of the court, yet, but because ethics and optics matter, as the email so plainly read. A message from an unknown number pinged Margaret's phone. She's spiraling. Adam's blaming her for everything now. Attached was a screenshot from a group chat. Adam's friend had leaked a message. "She planned this. She planted it. She played us. I just went along." Margaret stared at the message for a long time, the way you stare at a stranger you used to know. She didn't reply. She didn't have to. Later that day, she stood in her small sunroom, quietly trimming the edges of her old houseplant, the one Melanie always called ugly, when her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't anonymous. It was national. A producer from a morning news segment had sent a formal invitation. "We're covering a special on elder manipulation and legal independence. We would be honored to feature your voice. Confidential pre-interview, full control of content. Please let us know if you're interested. The country is listening." Margaret didn't respond right away. She closed her phone. Let the silence settle. She looked around the room she'd once felt invisible in. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel like she had to prove anything anymore. But maybe it was time to say it out loud anyway. Margaret opened her laptop, clicked reply, and typed 4 simple words. "Let's schedule the interview." Then, after a pause, she added, "But I'll bring the footage. They tried to light my life on fire, but they only burned themselves." The envelope was heavier than it should have been. Not in weight. Paper weighs nothing. But in meaning, it carried years. Margaret stood in front of the house she once called home. The morning air smelled faintly of wet grass and spring rot. Familiar, almost comforting. But this time, she stood not as a resident, but as a woman on her way out. Free, at last. She slid the envelope through the mail slot without a word, without a note. The silence said enough. 3 weeks earlier, she had sat in Carol's office, both women sipping lukewarm tea as a notary finalized the transaction. "This is the cleanest way," Carol said, tapping the deed transfer with a firm finger. "We sell the house. You transfer your share. No foreclosure, no court drama, just done." Margaret's voice was even. "And the buyer?" Carol smiled. "An LLC registered under Heartland Trust, which, surprise, you own." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "So I sell it to myself." Carol winked. "Legally? You're just a passive investor in a property management trust. Technically, the trust is the owner. Practically, You're still holding the leash." Margaret exhaled, slow and deep. Perfect. The eviction notice arrived at Adam and Melanie's door 2 days after. The sale closed. Melanie had opened it in her robe, coffee in hand, lips still stained from her wine the night before. "What the hell is this?" she shouted, storming through the living room. "Eviction? From who?" Adam scanned the letter twice before speaking. "It says the house was sold, majority stakeholder ownership invoked." "Majority?" Melanie shrieked. She didn't." "She did," Adam muttered. "She never put us on the full title, just partial. Remember? To protect us from liability. That's what she said." Melanie's eyes burned. "She lied." "No," Adam said bitterly. "We just never bothered to read the fine print." They filed a formal protest that afternoon, desperate, scrambling to undo what had been set in stone. But the county records didn't lie. Deed updated. Owner, Heartland Trust. Primary controller, Margaret Evelyn Hart. Occupants, unauthorized tenants. Status, eviction valid. Margaret was unreachable by phone. She had blocked both their numbers the morning the deed posted. At her favorite cafe near the waterfront, Margaret sipped her espresso slowly. The sun touched her skin through the window like a warm promise. She didn't look at her phone, not even once. She didn't need to. Carol slid into the booth across from her, a soft grin on her face. "Paperwork is final. Transfer closed, utilities rerouted, locks scheduled for rekey tomorrow." Margaret raised her glass slightly. "To freedom." Carol clinked her teacup in return. "And to fireproof exits." They sat in silence, the kind only earned through scars and sisterhood. Then Carol handed her a red folder. "This," she said, "is the official copy of the ruling. Signed, stamped, filed. You are exonerated, fully. No guardianship, no dementia ruling, no financial mismanagement." Margaret opened the folder, flipped through the pages, and paused at the last one. Then, with a pen from her purse, she drew one slow, black line through the names Adam Hart and Melanie Hart. Now, back at the house, the envelope she slid through the door carried that exact page. No names, no victory speech, just the truth. She turned around, heels crisp against the stone walkway, her back to the door they once locked her behind. She didn't look back, not even once. Behind her, the lights inside flickered on. Someone opened the envelope. A gasp, a scuffle of paper, and then silence. The good kind. The final kind. Inside the envelope, in black ink, one final annotation circled in red. Exhibit A. No longer yours. He called me Mom while filing lawsuits, but I never told him the truth. The envelope trembled in her hands, not because of fear, but memory. Old paper, a faint scent of mothballs and lemon oil, her signature a decade faded but still hers, and just beneath it, Adam's name, but not the one he believed. She traced the line slowly, eyes narrowing as she read the phrase that once meant hope. Finalized adoption, Adam Charles Whitmore, legal ward of Margaret Hart. She had tucked it away in the back of her father's war chest, a chest Adam was never allowed to open, not because it held weapons, but because it held the truth. The court date was tomorrow, and she was done shielding the boy who had grown into her betrayer. Flashback, 36 years earlier. The boy at the door was thin, 4 years old, covered in chicken nugget stains and abandonment. Social services called him a temporary placement. His biological parents had vanished during an interstate drug raid. Margaret, barely 31, had just buried her husband 2 weeks prior. Alone. Grieving. Then came Adam. He didn't cry when he arrived, just looked at her with huge, sunken eyes, as if waiting to be sent back. "I don't want a new mom," he whispered. "I'm not new," Margaret had said, kneeling. "I'm just next." He hadn't let go of her hand for 3 days. Now, as Carol read through the trust documents, her fingers suddenly halted. "Wait," she murmured. "Did you know this was in here?" Margaret looked up. "What?" Carol pointed to the fine print. "Clause 7? Subsection C. In the event of proven abuse or fraudulent petition against the trust creator by a direct beneficiary, said beneficiary forfeits all rights to claim, inheritance, or authority under this agreement. Permanently. Margaret blinked, then smiled, slowly. You wrote your future armor into the trust, Carol said, almost laughing. Years ago. I wrote it the day he called me selfish for not co-signing his second mortgage, Margaret said coldly. I knew one day his greed might outgrow my love. Carol handed her a blank affidavit. Let's make it official. The next morning, the courthouse steps were lined with reporters. Margaret ignored every flash, every question. She walked with poise, a navy shawl around her shoulders, the envelope held close to her chest. Inside, Melanie and Adam sat on the plaintiff's bench, tight-lipped, expressionless. They hadn't spoken since the eviction. Now they sat unified only in dread. Defense may proceed, the judge said. Margaret stood, opened the envelope, and passed it to the clerk. I'd like this entered into evidence, she said, with one addendum. The clerk unfolded it, eyes widening. It was the adoption certificate. Attached to it, her affidavit, notarized that morning. She turned toward Adam. You called me mom in court while petitioning to control my life, but you were never told you were adopted. I never wanted it to matter, until you made it matter. Adam stood up suddenly, red-faced. This is character assassination. No, Margaret said calmly. This is legal clarification. The judge banged the gavel. Mr. Hart, he said sharply, you're not on trial for adoption. You're on trial for manipulation and fraud. But your adoption status, in light of this trust clause, renders your claim legally void. Adam dropped into his chair like a man pushed from a ledge. Melanie leaned away from him. The courtroom was silent, except for a reporter whispering into a mic, this just took a nuclear turn. Later that night, the clip of Margaret's affidavit reading had gone viral. On forums, Twitter threads, morning podcasts, they called it the betrayer's birth certificate. Comments rolled in by the thousands. He tried to rob the woman who saved him. I'd be honored to call her mom. How do you sue someone who gave you a name? Margaret sat on her balcony, sipping tea under string lights, wrapped in silence. Her phone buzzed once. Adam's calling. She stared at the screen. Let it ring. Let it plead. Let it die. She pressed and held. Block contact. For good. In a drawer nearby, she placed the affidavit beside the original adoption form, labeled in bold, closed. By choice. Some things are better unread, others are better unspoken. The page in front of her was crisp and white. The pen in her hand was the same one she'd used to sign over custody of Adam 3 decades ago. It moved now, not with fury, but finality. Margaret sat in the bay window of her new downtown condo, sunlight pouring across her shoulder like warm silk. The city moved below her in muted motion, cars, people, sirens, and none of it touched her anymore. She had waited months for silence. Now it surrounded her like armor. The letter was written in ink that didn't bleed. Dear Adam, you were never a mistake, but you made one when you mistook my love for a license. Her hand paused. Not from doubt, but from a memory too old to stop flooding her fingers. She saw him again, 4 years old, holding her thumb in a hospital waiting room. It had been hours since child services dropped him off. He refused snacks, refused sleep. But when she offered him a blanket, he finally whispered, "Will you be my forever?" And she had said yes. She hadn't known that forever had terms and conditions for him. You filed legal papers against the woman who fed you, clothed you, forgave you. You called me confused, unstable, weak. But it wasn't confusion you saw. It was control you couldn't have. Margaret folded the letter once, then again. But she didn't seal it. Instead, she placed it in a drawer beside a stack of old postcards, ones she'd never mailed. Some were to her late husband, others to friends she'd lost along the way. This drawer wasn't for communication, it was for release. Her new condo had no upstairs creaks, no hallway shadows, no whispers through walls. The only sounds were the bubbling of her small indoor fountain and the low hum of classical music from the speakers hidden behind her bookshelf. Margaret filled the space with plants and books and soft yellow light. She bought a canary yellow kettle just because it made her smile. And she smiled now, more often than people knew what to do with. Each morning, she brewed tea, watered the ferns, opened her laptop, and responded to messages from nonprofits and local senior advocates. Some asked her to speak, others sent stories, haunting, familiar, grateful. She didn't always reply, but she read everyone. One envelope came with no return address. The handwriting was blocky, rushed, a court seal on the flap. Margaret slid it open with her thumb. Inside, a single page. Case number 37, B8192, Hart v. Hart verdict. Full exoneration. All claims dismissed. No further action required. Judge Lenora Walsh. She stared at the words like someone reading her own name on a gravestone and realizing she'd outlived it. No fanfare, no courtroom drama, just a final stamp. Closure, folded in thirds. She slipped the letter beside her estate file in the desk drawer. Then, in the same drawer, she reached for the old pen cam, the same one that had recorded whispers, threats, mockery, and turned them into proof. It sat in her hand like a spent bullet. Cold. Still, but with a history. She clicked it off for the last time. No more surveillance, no more baiting, no more war. Peace wasn't just the absence of chaos. It was choosing not to respond, even when you had the final word. That evening, her phone lit up with a new email. Subject: TEDx Women, Speaker Invitation, Margaret Hart. Message: We'd be honored if you would consider sharing your story. Title suggestion: How I Survived Being Silenced. Her lips curled, not in surprise, but recognition. This was never about revenge, it was about voice. And now, the world wanted to hear it. Margaret stood from her desk, walked to her closet, and pulled out a red blazer she hadn't worn in years. She smiled at her reflection and whispered, "Let's make this one unforgettable." They tried to erase me, but I left a recording they'll never forget. The room was silent, but not empty. Rows of women, young, old, and in between, sat in hushed reverence inside the TEDx venue, their attention locked on the stage. Red lights pulsed faintly behind the iconic white letters. Margaret Hart stood in the center in a scarlet blazer and low heels, a small lav mic clipped at her collarbone. Her hair was pinned in soft waves. Her hands didn't shake. She didn't look like someone who had survived a courtroom battle. She looked like someone who had written its ending. "The first time I was told I was confused," Margaret began, voice calm, "was by someone who once called me Mom." Soft murmurs rippled through the audience. Phones hovered silently above laps, already recording. "I wasn't confused," she said. "I was calculating." A pause. The air grew heavier. "I didn't shout. I didn't retaliate. I watched. I documented. I planted a pen camera in a bookshelf and waited for the truth to confess itself." On the giant screen behind her, a frame appeared. Frozen. Melanie's face mid-smirk, lips forming the phrase, "Once she's out, this'll all be ours." Gasps echoed through the auditorium. "I was called unstable," Margaret continued, "but my memory was sharp enough to recognize a forged signature, cold enough to sit through a psychiatric evaluation with a lawyer's vocabulary, and quiet enough to let my enemies narrate their own downfall." Laughter, tight and shocked, bubbled from a corner of the audience. "They said I forgot how I got bruised," she said, "but I remember who took the picture." She inhaled, just once, then released it. "Documentation," she said softly. "That's what saved me. Not rage, not revenge. Proof." The screen shifted, footage from a time-stamped clip of Melanie rehearsing fake tears. Another frame showed her whispering while scrolling through property listings on her phone. Then another, Adam holding a guardianship document, smirking over her sleeping form. "They said they loved me," Margaret whispered, "but their love depended on silence, on surrender, on access to bank accounts they didn't earn and a home they didn't build." A spotlight widened, washing the edges of her silhouette in gold. She took a step closer to the audience. "I didn't raise a criminal," she said, "but I didn't stop one either. And that was my mistake." People stopped blinking. "You know what made me dangerous?" Her voice hardened. Not that I remembered everything, but that I recorded it. Applause exploded. It started small, 2 hands, maybe 3, but it spread like wildfire. Cheers erupted, tears flowed. Women clutched each other's hands, strangers nodded at strangers. Margaret let it crest and fall before she spoke again. "Melanie's name is trending right now," she said. "Not because I said it, but because her own words were enough." In a montage played online that evening, Melanie's social media profiles were scrubbed clean. Her employer posted a public statement, "We take elder abuse very seriously." As for Adam, he was seen the next day behind a hardware store counter folding a mop display. A local blogger captured the photo. No one recognized him. No one stopped him. He didn't look up. Back on stage, Margaret closed her notes and looked directly into the camera. The room had stilled again. Time hung on her lips. "This story isn't just mine," she said. "It's for anyone who has been called crazy for remembering clearly, anyone whose truth was framed as confusion." She held up the pen camera. Its tiny light blinked once, then went dark. I didn't scream to be heard. I pressed record another beat. Then she smiled, just faintly. "They tried to call me crazy," Margaret said, her voice like a steady drum beat in the silence. "But I remembered everything." A pause. Her fingers wrapped slowly around the camera. "And I recorded it too. They tried to call me crazy, but I remembered everything. And I recorded it too."